The first time I saw the white SUV nosed into my driveway like it belonged there, I thought it had to be some kind of mistake. Maybe a lost delivery driver, maybe a guest who didn't know the difference between my property line and the curb. But when I knocked on the door next door, the door swung open to reveal Karen, our self-appointed queen of the neighborhood, and she crossed her arms with that smug tilt of her chin. "Oh, that's community parking now," she said, as though declaring my private concrete slab a public utility was the same as labeling recycling bins. I laughed, because what else do you do when reality takes a vacation? But she didn't laugh. She just adjusted her oversized sunglasses and said, "You should be proud to help out. Not everyone has space." That was the moment I realized this wasn't going to be a one-time inconvenience. It was the beginning of a war. I'd moved into this house 6 months earlier. I bought it specifically because it had a wide driveway and a double garage. After years of apartment complexes and parallel parking nightmares, the idea of pulling straight in, shutting the garage, and not circling blocks like a shark had been part of the dream. That driveway was not just concrete. It was freedom. But to Karen, apparently, it was a blank check. By the next weekend, there were 3 cars parked across the bottom half, boxing me in like I lived inside a corral. When I knocked again, Karen stepped out with her clipboard, the one she carried everywhere like it was an extension of her personality. "We had a vote," she said. "The association agreed that your driveway would serve as overflow parking. We'll be polite about it." She actually said that. Polite. As if trapping me in my own garage was neighborly etiquette. The absurdity of it was almost funny. Almost. Until Monday morning, when I had to leave for work and there was a battered minivan across my exit. I called the number Karen had scrawled on a paper she taped to my mailbox, a so-called overflow list. A groggy stranger picked up, said, "Hold on, I'll tell my cousin," and hung up. 20 minutes later, the van moved. I was late to work. That was when I stopped laughing. The HOA bylaws didn't say anything about commandeering private driveways. I flipped through the packet they shoved at me when I closed on the house, looking for some obscure clause Karen might weaponize. Nothing. Driveways were personal property. Period. So I confronted her in the street. "You don't have the authority," I told her. "That's trespassing." She gave me that smile that wasn't really a smile, more like a threat dressed up for church. "We do what's best for the community," she said. "If you can't be part of the solution, maybe you're not a good fit here." That word, fit, hung in the air like smoke. It wasn't about rules. It was about control. The first escalation came the following Friday. I returned from work to find a neatly printed flyer taped to every mailbox. Community parking policy, effective immediately. It wasn't signed by the board, but it was written in Karen's unmistakable passive-aggressive style. The bullet points said homeowners with extra space should contribute to neighborhood harmony by allowing overflow parking. My address was listed as the designated spot for Zone C. I tore the flyer down, crumpled it, and tossed it in the trash. 2 hours later, Karen was at my door. "You can't remove official HOA notices," she said, tapping her clipboard like it was a gavel. I asked her what law school she thought she'd graduated from. She called me hostile. That night, I parked my truck sideways across the mouth of my driveway, blocking any cars from entering. The next morning, someone had left a note on my windshield that read, "Selfish. The HOA will fine you." No signature. Just entitlement in black ink. The irony was delicious. They were the ones trespassing, yet I was the selfish one. That's when I realized this wasn't about one car or two. This was about Karen staking territory. She couldn't stand that my driveway represented independence, something she couldn't dictate. So I started documenting. Every car, every license plate, every time I was blocked in. Pictures, timestamps, the whole package. When Karen accused me at the next HOA meeting of undermining community spirit, I pulled up the slideshow on my phone. People shuffled in their seat. A couple neighbors even coughed awkwardly. But Karen pushed harder. "These photos are harassment," she snapped. "We need to address his behavior." She turned the narrative like only a practiced manipulator can. Suddenly, I was on trial for defending my own property. The turning point came one evening when I returned from the grocery store with a trunk full of food and found a sleek black sedan parked diagonally across my driveway. No note, no number, nothing. I honked, I knocked on doors, I waited. Nothing. Groceries sat in the trunk, milk sweating in the heat, ice cream melting into soup. After 45 minutes, I unloaded everything by hand from the street, carrying bags across the grass in the dark. When the driver finally strolled up, Karen's nephew, apparently, he smirked and said, "Relax, it's just a driveway." That was when something inside me clicked. This wasn't inconvenience anymore. This was humiliation. And I don't take kindly to being humiliated on my own property. I researched legal options. Trespassing complaints, tow policies. Most towing companies wouldn't touch it without police involvement, and the police shrugged, saying it was a civil HOA matter. Translation: they didn't want to deal with it. I could go to small claims court, but that would drag for months. I needed something immediate, something that would make the point unmistakably clear. That's when I stumbled across driveway deterrent. Low-profile tire spikes, the kind used in private lots to keep people from backing out without paying. Discreet, effective, completely legal on private property if marked. The idea lodged itself in my brain like a seed. I pictured the look on Karen's face when her entourage of freeloaders realized my driveway wasn't free parking, it was a trap. I pictured the hiss of air escaping tires, the sudden silence as engines died on flat rubber. It was almost poetic. But before I could act, I had to be certain. I double-checked ordinances. Nothing prohibited protective measures on private property, so long as they were visible. So I ordered them. Heavy steel, retractable, designed to fold flat when I wanted to drive in and pop up when I didn't. The shipping confirmation felt like a battle drum. While I waited for delivery, the situation escalated again. Karen started scheduling community events on my block. One Saturday morning, I woke to find balloons tied to lampposts and a dozen cars jammed into my driveway, spilling onto the grass. Kids darted between bumpers. Parents lounged in folding chairs like they were tailgating. Karen strutted up with her clipboard and said, "Oh good, you're here. We're using your space for Family Day." I asked her if she was insane. She said, "Don't be so dramatic. It's just one day." One day that ended with crushed flower beds, oil stains on the concrete, and a dent in my garage door. When I demanded compensation, she smirked. "Accidents happen. Maybe you shouldn't have fragile plants." That night, I stood in my garage staring at the dent until my jaw hurt from clenching. The morning after the spikes arrived, I woke up earlier than usual. It wasn't nerves exactly, more like the kind of anticipation you feel before the first move in a chess game you've been planning for weeks. The package sat in the corner of my garage, unassuming but heavy with promise. I brewed a pot of coffee, pulled on work gloves, and dragged the crates into the daylight. The sun was already cutting across the street, catching on Karen's blinds as she peeked through them like she always did. I didn't wave. She didn't either. We both knew something was shifting. Installing the spikes wasn't as simple as rolling out a welcome mat. I had to measure, drill, and anchor them into the concrete in a way that was both secure and retractable. Sweat ran down my neck as I worked, the whine of the drill echoing off the cul-de-sac. A couple neighbors slowed their morning walks to watch, curiosity written on their faces, but none asked questions. They had their own history with Karen. Some even gave me a nod, the kind men exchange when they recognize a quiet act of rebellion. I didn't explain. The less anyone knew, the better. By noon, the system was in place. Low-profile steel teeth ran in a neat line across the mouth of my driveway. With a simple lever hidden near my garage wall, I could flatten them for my car or raise them for unwanted guests. I stenciled bright yellow triangles on the concrete as warning signs, legally required visibility, though subtle enough that a distracted parker might overlook them. I stood back, hands on hips, and admired the way sunlight gleamed off the steel. It didn't scream aggression. It whispered consequences. That evening, as if summoned by fate, a silver sedan crept toward my driveway. I stood by the garage, arms folded, and watched it roll forward. The driver paused when the front wheels hovered inches above the spike. He leaned out the window, frowned at the warning triangles, and cursed under his breath before throwing the car into reverse. He parked 2 houses down instead. That moment, that hesitation, that retreat, was the first victory I'd had in months. It was intoxicating. Of course, Karen wasn't going to let it slide. The next day, she cornered me by the mailbox. Clipboard in hand, hair puffed into a halo of hairspray, she jabbed her pen toward the driveway. "What is that contraption?" she demanded. I told her plainly it was a protective measure. "For safety," I said, deliberately vague. She sniffed, flipping through her papers as if the answer might be hidden in fine print. "This is a violation of community aesthetics," she declared. I asked her to show me the bylaw about aesthetics of driveways. She stammered. There wasn't one. I walked away before she could spin the loss into another lecture. Days passed. The spikes worked exactly as intended. Cars slowed, saw them, and drove off. No more being boxed in, no more groceries hauled across the grass, no more smug nephews smirking at my inconvenience. It felt almost too easy. Which is why I wasn't surprised when the retaliation came. Karen was not the type to retreat gracefully. She had to reassert her dominance, even if it meant bending reality to her will. The first move came at an HOA meeting. I walked into the community center to find a new flyer taped to the podium. Agenda Item 4, Hazardous Installations on Residential Property. Karen stood at the front, already in full swing, painting me as some kind of lunatic arming my driveway with medieval weapons. "It's dangerous for children," she insisted, her voice dripping with staged concern. "It creates liability for the entire association." A few heads nodded, but most people looked skeptical. They'd all seen the circus in my driveway for weeks. They knew who the real menace was. When the vote was called, the motion to force me to remove the spikes failed. Barely. 6 against, 5 for. Karen's face twisted as the count was announced, her smile cracking like thin glass. She muttered something about appealing to higher authority, but the room had already moved on. I knew then she wasn't finished. She never was. Sure enough, 2 mornings later, I found a city code enforcement officer standing in my driveway, clipboard in hand. He was polite, professional, but clearly sent on a mission. "We've had a complaint about a hazardous obstruction," he said. I explained the spikes were retractable, clearly marked, and on private property. He inspected, scribbled notes, and after 20 minutes, told me there was no violation. "You're fine," he said. "But I'd expect more complaints." I shook his hand and thanked him, but inside I felt the tightening coil of Karen's persistence. That evening, Karen cornered me again. "You think you're clever," she said, her voice low enough that only I could hear. "But you're dividing the neighborhood. People don't like troublemakers." I asked her if they liked blocked driveways and unpaid damages. She smiled, the kind of smile predators wear when they smell blood. "We'll see how long you last here," she said, and walked off. It wasn't an empty threat. Over the next week, small acts of sabotage started piling up. My trash cans were knocked over repeatedly. A neighbor mentioned that Karen had been whispering that I was unstable and paranoid. One afternoon, I came home to find eggs splattered on my garage door. None of it proved anything, but the message was clear. Karen wanted me gone. Instead of breaking, I doubled down. I installed a security camera above the garage, angled to capture the driveway and street. The red recording light blinked like an unblinking eye. I wanted her to know I was watching now. The next day, the egging stopped. The trash cans stayed upright. The whispers continued, but whispers don't dent metal or block cars. Spikes and cameras, That was my language now. Still, she kept pushing. The real escalation came during a Saturday afternoon when I returned home to find not just one car, but 3 lined across my driveway. Somehow, in broad daylight, someone had folded the spikes flat. My lever was intact, but the mechanism had been tampered with. I stood there staring at the cars, rage crawling up my spine. Karen appeared moments later, pretending to water her plants. "Oh dear," she called out, fake sympathy dripping from her tone. "Looks like your little toys aren't working." That was when I realized she must have gotten someone to break into my garage. The lever wasn't outside, it was locked inside, next to my tools. The violation was staggering. It wasn't just about parking anymore. It was about trespassing inside my home. I dialed the police. When the officer arrived, Karen played innocent, wide-eyed, insisting she had no idea how the cars ended up there. The officer shrugged again, repeating the same useless line about civil matters. I felt like I was shouting into a void. But then the officer noticed the security camera. I pulled up the feed on my phone, and there it was, a grainy but unmistakable shot of Karen's nephew slipping into my garage door after fiddling with the lock, followed by him waving the cars in like some kind of twisted valet. The officer's eyebrows shot up. Suddenly it wasn't a civil matter anymore. Suddenly it was breaking and entering. I didn't have to wait long to find out what Karen's idea of revenge looked like. It started with letters. Not official notices from the HOA board, because she no longer had the votes to carry a motion, but thin envelopes slid under my door, tucked into my mailbox, even left under my windshield wiper. Each one carried the same message in different variations. Complaints about my aggressive measures, warnings that I was alienating the neighborhood, threats that fines would accumulate if I didn't comply. None of them were signed. The handwriting varied, but the tone was unmistakably hers, self-righteous, shrill, dripping with entitlement. It was her way of trying to create the illusion of consensus, as if the whole neighborhood had turned against me when, in reality, most people were enjoying the quiet that my spikes had finally restored. For a week, I tossed the letters in a shoebox in my garage, half amused, half irritated. But by the second week, the campaign escalated. I came home one evening to find a "for sale" sign hammered into my front yard. Not mine, of course. It was a cheap knockoff, flimsy plastic, but the implication was clear. She wanted the neighborhood to believe I was leaving. A couple of curious neighbors stopped by, asking if it was true. I told them it wasn't, and one of them chuckled and muttered, "Figures, it's Karen." But I didn't laugh. This wasn't just pettiness anymore. It was a smear campaign. She was trying to make me into the outsider, the unstable one, the cancer in her perfect little community. I decided to lean into my strategy of documentation. Every letter, every fake notice, every petty act went into a new folder. Karen wore Exhibit B. The first folder, Exhibit A, already had photos of blocked cars and videos of trespassing. Now I was building a second case, one brick at a time. I didn't know yet if I'd use it in court, in a complaint to the city, or maybe even in a lawsuit, but I knew better than to fight her with anger alone. She thrived on that. What she couldn't fight was evidence. Then came the garbage incident. One morning, I stepped outside to the stench of rot. My trash cans, which I had neatly left at the curb the night before, had been dragged halfway up my driveway and overturned. Raw chicken packaging, spoiled milk cartons, coffee grounds, all of it smeared across my concrete like a crime scene. And right in the middle of it was a printed sign, laminated no less, that read, "This is what happens when you divide the community." I stared at it for a long time, not because I was shocked but because I couldn't believe the level of effort. She had laminated the threat. Who laminates their petty revenge? I scrubbed the driveway, gagging on the smell, and mounted a second camera, this one aimed directly at the curb. That night, I sat in my living room with the feed streaming on my phone. At 2 a.m, the motion alert pinged. There she was. Karen, in her ridiculous pink robe, hair in rollers, sneaking up the street with a black trash bag. She yanked open my can and dumped it inside, then scurried off into the dark like a raccoon. I clipped the footage, saved it, and went back to bed with the strange satisfaction of knowing her arrogance had outpaced her common sense. The next day, I didn't confront her. That was the part that drove her crazy. She expected shouting, accusations, drama. Instead, I smiled, waved, and said nothing. She shifted uncomfortably, her eyes narrowing behind those oversized sunglasses. She knew I knew, and that I wasn't playing the game on her terms. That silence was my weapon, but silence only fueled her desperation. The following weekend, I noticed an unusual number of cars parked along the street. More than usual, more than even a family gathering would require. I soon realized why. Karen was hosting what she called a special HOA meeting. Only it wasn't in the community center like usual. It was on her lawn. Rows of folding chairs, pitchers of lemonade, stacks of flyers. And in the middle of it, a giant poster board with my house printed on it, blown up from a satellite image, spikes highlighted in red like some kind of criminal evidence. I stayed inside at first, watching from the upstairs window as neighbors shuffled uncomfortably in their seat. Karen launched into a speech, her voice carrying across the cul-de-sac. She accused me of creating a hostile environment, endangering children, and turning the neighborhood into a war zone. She even held up the laminated sign from the garbage incident, claiming she had found it near my property. That was her fatal mistake. She was trying to frame me with her own handiwork. I stepped outside then, calm as ever, holding my phone. Funny thing about accusations, I said loudly enough for the crowd to hear, they look different when you see them on video. I tapped the screen, and the footage of her dumping trash rolled across my phone speaker. The crowd gasped, a ripple of whispers breaking through her speech. Karen froze, color rising in her cheek. "That's taken out of context," she shrieked, but the damage was done. Half the audience stood up and walked away, shaking their heads. The Queen's Court was crumbling. But Karen wasn't finished. That night, she filed an official complaint with the city, claiming my spikes violated safety codes and created a hazard for emergency vehicles. The next morning, a fire marshal knocked on my door. He was polite like the code officer before him, but thorough. He inspected the spikes, tested the retraction mechanism, checked the warning paint. After an hour, he shook my hand. "Everything looks compliant," he said. "She's wasting your time." But as he left, he added, "Document everything. Someone like that doesn't give up easy." His words proved prophetic. Within days, I noticed new faces in the neighborhood, strangers walking slowly past my house, snapping photos, muttering into their phones. It didn't take long to figure out what Karen had done. She had hired an attorney. Or at least she wanted people to think she had. Rumors spread that a lawsuit was coming, that I'd be forced to remove the spikes and pay damages for stress inflicted on the community. Neighbors whispered, kids stared, and for the first time, I felt the weight of isolation pressing in. She wasn't winning, but she was wearing me down. One evening, as I sat in the garage flipping through my growing pile of evidence, I caught myself wondering if it was worth it. If maybe selling the house and moving somewhere quiet would be easier. But then I thought of the melted ice cream in the trunk that night, of the dent in my garage door, of the smug look on her nephew's face. No. This wasn't just about concrete anymore. This was about principle. Karen didn't just want my driveway. She wanted control. And if I gave in, she'd take more, until there was nothing left. So I doubled down again. I expanded my camera system, added motion-activated lights, and set up a hidden trail camera in the bushes across the street to capture wide-angle shots of anyone approaching my house. If Karen wanted to escalate, she'd find I was more than ready. I wasn't angry anymore. I was patient, calm, focused. She was playing checkers. I was playing chess. It started with a knock at the door on a Tuesday morning, sharp and deliberate, the kind that doesn't belong to a neighbor borrowing sugar or a kid selling cookies. When I opened it, 2 uniformed police officers stood on the porch. One of them was holding a folded sheet of paper. My stomach sank even before he spoke. "We've received a noise complaint and allegations of harassment," he said. I raised an eyebrow. The street was quiet enough to hear birdsong. I hadn't so much as mowed the lawn that morning. But Karen was standing across the street, arms folded, her phone held up like she was filming a reality show. I invited the officers inside, showed them my setup. Quiet house, cameras rolling, no speakers, no parties, nothing. I explained how my cameras had caught my neighbor trespassing multiple times, how I had documented months of harassment. To their credit, the officers were professional. They asked a few questions, jotted notes, and left without issuing any citation. But Karen didn't care about the outcome. She cared about the spectacle. She wanted the whole street to see the police at my door, to feed the narrative that I was a problem neighbor. For her, perception was power. That night, I scrolled through the footage again and again. I didn't feel angry anymore. I felt strategic. Every stunt she pulled was more evidence in my growing arsenal. I emailed the footage to a cloud account, backed it up on a hard drive, even printed stills. If she wanted a war of attrition, I was building a fortress. But even fortresses can be tested. The next escalation came 2 days later. I woke up to the sound of clanging metal. When I rushed outside, I found 2 contractors in reflective vests tearing into the corner of my driveway with power tools. A small truck with Neighborhood Improvements Initiative magnetized to the side was parked at the curb. Karen was there, clipboard in hand, directing them like she was some kind of general. "We're widening the community path," she declared when I demanded an explanation. "It's an HOA-approved project." My jaw tightened. They were literally cutting into my concrete. I demanded proof. No permits, no board approval, no signatures. Just Karen's voice, loud and insistent, claiming she had consensus. I called the police again. This time, the officers sided with me immediately. The contractors were ordered to stop, their tools confiscated until the dispute was resolved. They packed up quickly, muttering apologies. Karen tried to protest, but one of the officers threatened her with charges for unauthorized construction. Her face went pale, though she tried to cover it with indignation. "You're dividing this neighborhood," she hissed at me as the truck pulled away. By now, even the most neutral neighbors were starting to see the truth. Her antics weren't about community. They were about control. Some stopped by to quietly voice their support, telling me they were tired of being bossed around. But they weren't brave enough to say it publicly. Karen had ruled this block with fear for years, and fear doesn't vanish overnight. I couldn't blame them, but I could use it. Every ally, silent or not, was another crack in her armor. One evening, as I took out the trash, my next-door neighbor, a quiet man named Alan, approached me. He spoke softly, like he was afraid of being overheard. "I've got copies of emails," he said. "Karen's been writing to the board behind everyone's back, claiming we all support her. We don't. If you ever need it, I'll back you up." He slipped a USB drive into my hand like it was contraband. Inside were threads of emails where Karen exaggerated support, twisted words, and even forged signatures. It was dynamite. I thanked him, told him to keep his head down. This wasn't just my fight anymore, it was bigger. The Real explosion came on a Sunday afternoon. I had just finished washing my truck when I noticed a tow truck idling at the end of the street. The driver looked uncertain, flipping through paperwork. Karen was right beside him, pointing furiously at my driveway. "That one," she kept saying. I walked up calmly, drying my hands on a rag. "What's the problem?" The driver frowned. "Got a call about an abandoned vehicle blocking community access." I laughed, but not out of humor. My truck was spotless, legally registered, and parked squarely on my own property. I showed him the registration, pointed to the cameras, and explained the situation. The driver's frown deepened. He muttered something about not wanting to get involved in neighbor wars, climbed back in his cab, and drove off. Karen screamed after him, her voice cracking, insisting he was neglecting his duty. He ignored her. That moment was a turning point. She wasn't just stretching the rules anymore, she was fabricating emergencies. And that made her dangerous. I filed a formal harassment report with the police, attaching every piece of evidence I had. The letters, the trash footage, the fake for-sale stunt, the contractors, the tow attempt. The officer at the station looked exhausted just listening to it all. "This is escalating fast," he admitted. "If it continues, you might want to consider a restraining order." The idea lodged in my brain. Restraining order. It had a nice ring to it. But I knew Karen wouldn't stop just because of paperwork. She needed to be humiliated in a way that even her ego couldn't spin. The chance came sooner than expected. The HOA announced its annual community barbecue, an event Karen usually treated like her coronation. Flyers promised food, music, games, the works. Normally, I would have avoided it, but this time, I saw an opportunity. I brought copies of Alan's emails, neatly printed and stapled, along with stills from my security footage. When Karen took the stage with her usual pomp, I waited. She launched into her speech about unity, about pride, about watching out for each other. The hypocrisy was thick enough to choke on. When she paused for applause, I stepped forward. Calm, deliberate, holding my folder. "Funny thing about unity," I said. "It doesn't look like trash dumped on driveways or forged signatures." I handed the stack of emails to the HOA president, who had been growing increasingly weary of Karen's power plays. He flipped through them, his expression darkening. Then I pulled out the photo stills. Karen in her robe with the trash, Karen directing contractors on my driveway, Karen beside the tow truck. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Phones came out, snapping photos of the evidence. Karen tried to laugh it off, her voice brittle. "He's obsessed. He's stalking me." But the tide had turned. Neighbors who had once sat quietly were now whispering loudly, some even booing. The HOA president cleared his throat, called for order, and announced that an emergency vote would be scheduled to reconsider Karen's position on the board. Her face twisted in shock, the clipboard slipping from her hand. She sputtered protests, but they fell flat. The Queen was wobbling on her throne. That night, she pounded on my door, shrieking that I had ruined her reputation, that I would pay for this. I didn't answer. I just let the camera record, the red light blinking steadily. Her words were wild, frantic, unhinged. When she finally stormed off, the silence she left behind felt heavier than the shouting. The nails were the last straw. Finding them scattered across the concrete felt less like a prank and more like a declaration. Somebody wanted my tires to blow, my family to be stranded, maybe worse. I swept them up with shaking fingers and set the bucket in the garage, then replayed the footage again until the grainy pixels felt like fingerprints, footsteps, a shadow, the quick flash of a hoodie. Whoever had done it knew how to move in the dark. Whoever had done it wanted me scared. I wasn't. Scared never fixed anything. It only sharpens the plan. I printed the nails stills, enlarged them to poster size, and taped them across the garage wall like evidence in a detective's office. My living room looked less like a home and more like a war room. Maps of camera angles, timelines, lists of witnesses. Friends I trusted came by, discreet and steady, offering help with small, practical things. "Keep the receipts, don't engage publicly, let me drop off dinner." Alan brought over a cooler of beers and a list of quiet neighbors who were willing to back up anything I said if it came to court. Every small kindness felt like armor. It was time to make this official. I scheduled a meeting with the detective who'd been sympathetic at the station, the one who said this was escalating, who had told me to document everything. He arrived at my kitchen table with a battered notebook and coffee in a paper cup, and we went through the chronology, from the first SUV to the nails to the forged emails. He listened without interrupting, then nodded. "This looks criminal," he said, and the word landed in the room heavy and solemn. "We'll open a case. For the first time, it felt like the instruments of the law might actually move. But law moves slowly, and Karen moved fast. That night, someone slashed the sidewall of my truck. It wasn't a shallow scratch. The tire had been cut deep, a neat, professional slice that made the rubber fold like paper. I found it at dawn, the tire deflated into a sad black donut. My hands went cold. Whoever had done this wasn't playing games anymore. They were escalating in ways that could cause real harm. I called the detective, who arrived within the hour, flashlight bobbing, shoes squeaking on the driveway. He took photographs, fingerprints, the whole shebang. There was a small smear of mud on the rim, a trace of fabric caught in the cut, nothing conclusive yet, but enough to keep him interested. When neighbors started offering to drive me places, I felt both grateful and guilty. I didn't want them dragged into this, but I also knew that solidarity had quickly become the thing Karen feared most. She ran on isolation. Her power came from convincing people she was the only one who cared enough to maintain order. If they stood together, loud and tangible, her throne would wobble. That fact shaped the next, quieter phase of my plan. This wasn't about traps or revenge. It was about reclaiming the narrative, the community, and making sure evidence, hard, undeniable, followed every claim. I started hosting small get-togethers. A morning coffee for the cul-de-sac, a casual barbecue where nobody felt obliged to listen to Karen's speeches. I made sure people signed in, just a simple sheet with names and times. It was almost silly how mundane it felt, how harmless. But the sign-ins created normalcy, a record, a steady drumbeat that countered the drama. People came because I made it easy and pleasant, not because I asked for loyalty. They brought potato salad and stories about other neighbors who had been bullied by Karen in the past. Each story added context, created a mosaic of patterns. And then I did something I'd resisted because it felt theatrical. I called a neighborhood meeting and asked the HOA president to chair it. I wanted a public forum where allegations could be heard and evidence presented. Some neighbors were nervous. What if Karen turned it into another performance? What if she accused me of harassment again? I told them calmly that silence had allowed the situation to grow, and evidence needed a hearing. The president agreed, perhaps more out of exhaustion than leadership, and the date was set. I printed copies of Alan's emails, the trash footage, the contractor debacle, the tow truck incident, the nails, the slashed tire stills. Each printout felt heavy in my hands like proof you can't argue with. When the meeting day arrived, the cul-de-sac buzzed with a different kind of electricity, not the jittery, anxious buzz of fear, but a steady, confident hum. Neighbors filed in, not in support of me per se, but in support of a fair process. Karen stood at the edge like a queen waiting for a court to coronate her, but her usual crowd was thinner. I set up the laptop and walked them through the timeline, keeping my voice flat and precise. I didn't try to inflame or gloat. I let the footage speak. I let the emails and the photos and the dates and the times form an argument that even the most charitable observer couldn't ignore. Midway through the presentation, Karen tried to interrupt. Her voice rose, high and frantic, but the room had already shifted. People that had once avoided eye contact now met her gaze, and the looks were not sympathetic. "We all want a peaceful neighborhood," one elderly woman said, and then she told a story about how Karen had called the police on her when she left a ladder at the curb. Another neighbor stood and recounted how Karen had pressured him into repainting his mailbox even though it was fine. One by one, the small accounts piled up until they looked less like anecdotes and more like a pattern of coercion and control. When I finished, the HOA president cleared his throat and announced an emergency vote to remove Karen from her committee roles pending investigation. It wasn't an expulsion, those things require paperwork and legal steps, but it was a public rebuke, a formal cooling off. Karen's face flushed crimson. She sputtered about defamation, about how I was conspiring to destroy her life. But the room was not persuaded. The vote passed by a comfortable margin. The relief in the air felt almost sweet. People smiled, tentative at first, then broader. The neighborhood had reclaimed itself. I should have felt victorious. Instead, a quiet dread settled in my gut. She'd been pushed and humiliated, yes, but humiliation can make people dangerous in ways that are unpredictable. The detective called that afternoon with a small update. The mud smear on the rim matched a pair of boots linked to Karen's nephew. DNA testing would take time, but this was the kind of lead that could change a harassment complaint into criminal charges. I slept poorly that night, not because I feared for my safety, but because I feared for what vindication might require of me. Court dates, depositions, the public airing of months of petty, vindictive behavior. I wanted the neighborhood back without dragging anyone, my family, my friends, through a public soap opera. And then the truck arrived. Not mine, not Karen's, but the city's heavy-duty sweeper that rolled down the street at dawn and hummed away, nibbling up the last traces of nails, dirt, and rumors. It was a small thing, but as I watched it pass, I felt a curtain fall. The cul-de-sac was cleaner, literally and figuratively. People waved at the operator, and neighbors exchanged small talk. The normal ebb of life restarted. It was fragile, of course. Nothing here had been fragile when it started. It had been a solid, unapologetic greed for control. But normalcy was a muscle, and we'd started exercising it again. The week after the emergency vote felt like standing in the eye of a hurricane. The air was unnervingly still, the streets clean, the usual background hum of conflict absent. Karen didn't storm my porch, didn't call the police, didn't send more letters. For the first time in months, I walked out of my house without the tension in my shoulders that had become second nature. But that calm didn't fool me. Karen had been publicly humiliated, stripped of her authority, and exposed for the manipulator she was. Someone like her didn't retreat quietly. She regrouped. I knew it. Everyone knew it. The question was how big her final swing would be. The answer came the following Saturday in the form of an envelope with no return address, slid neatly under my door. Inside was a single page typed in bold font. Notice of pending civil action. No attorney's letterhead, no docket number, no court stamp. Just a dramatic title followed by accusations of defamation, property damage, emotional distress, and half a dozen other legal buzzwords. I almost laughed, except the part of me that had been living under siege for months whispered that this was the opening move in something uglier. Karen wanted to escalate from neighborhood drama into a courtroom drama. I took the notice straight to the detective handling my case. He read it, raised an eyebrow, and set it down. "This isn't real," he said. "At best, it's intimidation. At worst, it's fraud. But intimidation can be effective if your audience is tired, and I was exhausted. Still, I filed it into Exhibit C, my growing stack of documented nonsense. Karen's greatest weakness was her inability to resist putting everything in writing. 2 days later, the real escalation arrived. A city code inspector knocked on my door, clipboard in hand, explaining that multiple complaints had been filed alleging my property was unsafe. The spikes, the cameras, the lights, all of it supposedly creating a hazard for emergency responders and violating municipal ordinances. He walked the property line carefully, measuring, taking photos, jotting note. I stayed calm, answered questions, and provided every permit, every receipt, every compliance document I had kept meticulously organized for this very moment. After nearly an hour, he looked up from his clipboard and said, "You're fine. Everything is compliant." He paused, then added, "But whoever's filing these reports isn't going to stop. Be prepared." That night, I sat in the garage staring at my wall of evidence. It looked less like a homeowner defending a driveway and more like a federal investigation into organized crime. And in a way it was. Karen's empire wasn't guns or drugs. It was control. Her tools weren't weapons. They were lies, intimidation, and bureaucracy. But like any empire built on fear, once cracks appeared, it started to collapse. Neighbors who used to stay silent were speaking up now, emboldened by her fall from grace. I received texts from people I barely knew thanking me for standing my ground. They had stories, too. Years of small humiliations and petty fines she had levied for things that didn't even exist in the bylaws. For the first time, Karen wasn't the voice of the neighborhood. She was the echo of its worst instincts, and people were finally recognizing it. Still, she wasn't finished. The very next morning, I woke to the sound of shouting outside. Karen was in the middle of the cul-de-sac, hair wild, clipboard gone, clutching a megaphone like a town crier. "This man is dangerous," she screamed, pointing at my house. "He's turned our neighborhood into a prison. He spies on us, threatens us, intimidates us." Her voice cracked as she ranted, spittle flying, accusations tumbling over each other. A few neighbors filmed from their porches, their faces a mix of amusement and pity. I stepped outside, not to engage, but to hold up my phone where the red recording light was clear. The moment Karen saw it, her voice faltered. She dropped the megaphone and stormed back into her house. By evening, the video was circulating on the neighborhood Facebook group. Comments piled up. Some mocked her, some expressed concern for her mental state, but the overwhelming majority sided with reality. Karen had lost it. The queen had become the jester, her throne replaced with a stage she couldn't control. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was fighting her alone. The community had stopped watching from behind curtains and started pulling them open. But the most surprising twist came from inside her own house. 2 nights later, there was a knock at my door. When I opened it, a young man stood there. Karen's nephew, the same smug kid who once smirked at me after blocking my driveway. Only now, the smirk was gone. He looked nervous, shifting from foot to foot. "Can I talk to you?" he asked. Against my better judgment, I let him in. He sat at my kitchen table and told me he was done being her errand boy. He admitted to parking in my driveway at her direction, tampering with my spikes, even scattering the nails. But the slashed tire? He swore that wasn't him. He said Karen had gotten more erratic, more paranoid, yelling at family, insisting everyone was conspiring against her. "She's going to burn the whole place down just to win," he muttered, eyes downcast. He slid a USB stick across the table. "Emails, recordings. Proof she planned all this. I'm done covering for her." Then he stood, thanked me quietly, and left. I stared at the USB like it was a live grenade. When I finally plugged it in, what I found was staggering. Emails to fake addresses, drafts of anonymous complaints, even a recorded voice memo where Karen rehearsed accusations about me being unstable and dangerous. It wasn't just pettiness anymore. It was obsession. And obsession leaves fingerprints. I forwarded everything to the detective, who called me within hours. "This changes things," he said. "With this, we can push for harassment and possibly fraud charges. You might want to consider pressing forward legally." The words hung in the air like a verdict. Pressing forward legally meant courtrooms, testimonies, dragging the entire neighborhood into the mess. It meant winning decisively but also prolonging the war. I wasn't sure I wanted that. But then I thought of the nails, the slashed tire, the humiliation she had tried to rain down on me and everyone else. Maybe closure required the kind of finality only a courtroom could deliver. The neighborhood meeting that month was the most crowded I'd ever seen. Word of Karen's meltdown, her nephew's defection, and the looming investigation had spread. The HOA president announced formally that Karen was suspended from all board duties pending the outcome of the legal process. She wasn't present. Her blinds stayed drawn, her driveway empty. The silence from her house was deafening. Some said she had gone to stay with relatives, others that she was hiding from embarrassment. Whatever the truth, the absence was palpable. For the first time in a long while, the cul-de-sac breathed easy. Kids played in the street without being scolded. Neighbors chatted at mailboxes without looking over their shoulders. Life resumed. The letter with those 5 words didn't leave my mind for days. I kept it on the counter, folded and unfolded it, stared at the shaky pen strokes until they felt like scratches carved directly into my nerves. "You haven't won yet. Watch. A bluff? A warning? Or just Karen's inability to surrender? I'd seen her cling to illusions of power long past their expiration date, but this was different. The tone wasn't defiant, it was desperate. And desperate people don't play by rules, they lash out. The neighborhood was still basking in the novelty of peace. Kids played basketball in driveways, people waved at each other during evening walks. The HOA president actually looked relaxed at the last meeting. They thought it was over, that Karen had been dethroned for good. But I knew better. I'd seen the look in her eyes too many times, the way she fed on attention like oxygen. If silence had settled, she was choking on it. The letter was proof. 3 nights later, I woke to the sound of metal scraping against metal. My heart kicked hard, the kind of adrenaline surge that makes your skin tingle. I grabbed my phone and opened the live camera feed. On screen, shadows moved near my garage. 2 figures crouched by my truck, one fumbling with the door handle while the other stood lookout. Their faces were obscured by hoods, but the posture, the twitchy impatience, it screamed amateur. I hit record, then dialed the detective's direct line. By the time the police arrived, the would-be thieves had bolted, leaving behind a crowbar and a half-broken lockpick. The footage was clear enough. One of them was Karen's nephew again, dragged back into her orbit despite his attempt at escape. The second figure, taller, heavier, was harder to identify, but the timing, the location, and the fact they'd chosen my garage left little doubt who had orchestrated it. Karen had escalated from harassment to sabotage to attempted break-ins. The detective's face was grim as he bagged the crowbar. "This is more than harassment now," he said. "This is criminal. We'll bring it forward." His tone was steady, but I caught the flicker in his eyes, concern. Not just for evidence, but for me. I had become the focus of Karen's obsession, and obsession has no ceiling. The next morning, the cul-de-sac buzzed with rumors. Some had seen the flashing police lights, others whispered about attempted theft. Karen's blinds stayed shut, but I imagined her pacing behind them, waiting for the moment her version of the story could twist into the light. Except this time, she had no version left. The cameras, the crowbar, the nephew, it was all too tangible. Neighbors weren't whispering about me anymore. They were whispering about her, about whether she had finally crossed the line from nuisance into danger. A week later, the summons arrived. Not for me, for her. Charges of criminal trespass, vandalism, conspiracy to commit burglary. The nephew, faced with clear evidence and already rattled by his own conscience, cut a deal and gave a statement. In his words, Karen had promised to take the neighborhood back, if he helped her, teach me a lesson. The courtroom was no longer hypothetical. It was happening. Walking into that courthouse months later felt surreal. The sterile walls, the echo of footsteps, the murmur of voices, it was so far removed from the cul-de-sac battles that had started all of this. Yet every detail of my driveway war was laid out in binders, folders, exhibits labeled *F, photographs of trash piles, copies of laminated signs, video stills of her sneaking with garbage bags, printouts of her forged emails. My garage wall had become a courtroom arsenal. Karen sat at the defense table, smaller than I'd ever seen her. The clipboard was gone, replaced with trembling hands. She still tried to mask it with arrogance, whispering to her lawyer, rolling her eyes during testimony. But the effect was hollow. The jury didn't see a queen. They saw a neighbor who had spun a community into chaos for the sake of control. I testified calmly, just as I had lived the ordeal. I described each escalation, not with anger but with precision. I let the evidence carry the weight. The prosecution rolled the footage from my cameras. The trash dumping, the contractor stunt, the driveway carnival, the nephew sneaking into my garage. Each clip felt like a nail driven into the coffin of her credibility. The defense tried to paint me as obsessive, a man with too many cameras, too many folders. But obsession is easy to defend when it's framed as protection. Wouldn't you document if you were being harassed? I asked the jury, and their nods told me the answer. The trial stretched days into weeks. Neighbors testified, some reluctantly, some with pent-up relief. Alan brought his emails. The elderly woman told her latter story. The man with the mailbox spoke about pressure and fines. Each voice added to the chorus until the pattern was undeniable. Karen wasn't a victim. She was a tyrant whose tools had finally failed her. When the verdict came, it wasn't surprising. Guilty on trespass. Guilty on vandalism. Not guilty on the burglary conspiracy. Too thin for proof beyond doubt, but enough to shatter her myth of invincibility. The sentence wasn't prison. It was probation, fines, mandatory community service. But the real punishment wasn't written in the court's order. It was written in the silence that followed her home. No more clipboard, no more flyers, no more declarations of community property. She had lost the only thing she ever valued: control. The neighborhood began to heal. Slowly, awkwardly, but surely. People painted fences without fear of citations. Kids rode bikes without being scolded for safety violations. The HOA meetings, once Karen's stage, became mundane discussions about landscaping and snowplows. Boring never felt so good. My spikes stayed in the driveway, gleaming quietly in the sunlight, not as weapons anymore but as reminders. Boundaries matter. I didn't gloat. Victory didn't taste like fireworks. It tasted like quiet mornings with coffee, like uninterrupted afternoons working on my truck, like evenings where neighbors stopped by just to chat. Karen still lived there, tucked inside her house, blinds drawn. She walked the street sometimes, eyes down, no clipboard in sight. The air shifted around her. No one feared her anymore. No one listened. She was just another neighbor, stripped of her crown. One evening, months after the trial, I found myself sweeping leaves off the driveway. A kid on a bike slowed, pointed at the spikes, and asked, "What are those for?" I smiled. "They're just to remind people where the line is." The kid nodded, satisfied, and pedaled off. I stood there a long time, broom in hand, staring at the steel teeth glinting in the last rays of the sun. They weren't about punishing anymore. They were about protecting. Looking back, it's almost funny how it all began, with a car parked where it didn't belong, with a neighbor who thought entitlement was law. She declared my driveway community parking, and in her arrogance, she started a war she couldn't win. What she didn't understand was that some people fight with anger, others with fists, but the most dangerous kind fight with patience, with evidence, with strategy. I never had to scream. I never had to stoop to her level. I just had to draw the line and hold it,